She was 19 years old, and she owned $19, and she had walked 11 miles north of a town called Willow Bend, carrying a satchel, with one change of clothes, a tin cup, and a brass compass with a crack across its glass, like a vein of lightning frozen mid-strike. Behind her lay a homestead she had been born to, and had no legal claim to anymore, not by any paper a county clerk would recognize. Ahead of her, on a hillside the local men called too dry and too steep for anything but rattlesnakes and regret, she would dig a hole into the earth with her own 2 hands, and that hole would keep her warmer through a Nebraska winter than the frame houses of men who had laughed when they heard what she meant to do. That part comes later. Settle in for it. Tell the narrator, if you would, where you're listening from tonight, what state, what country, what kind of evening you're having, because this is a long story, the kind best heard slow, and it deserves your company the whole way through. It begins, as these things often do, with a paper. Not a gun, not a fire, not a single raised voice. A paper, signed and countersigned, filed on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1884 in a land office that smelled of tallow candles and old ledger dust, where a cousin she had known her whole life counted out $19 onto a counter without once meeting her eyes and called it her share. But to understand why $19 felt like both an insult and, in some strange way, a mercy, you have to go back another decade to a smaller house, a warmer kitchen, and a fever that took 2 people in the space of 11 days. She was 9 years old in the autumn of 1874 when her parents died. Her mother first, on a Thursday, and her father 6 days later, as though he could not bring himself to outlast her by very long. The house grew quiet in the particular way houses grow quiet after illness has moved through them and taken what it came for. There was a smell that lingered for weeks afterward, of camphor and boiled linen, that she would remember for the rest of her life whenever she caught even a trace of it in some other sick room, decades on. It was her grandfather who came for her father's father, a lean, weathered man who had spent 30 years surveying land for the railroad and for the government before that, a man who spoke rarely but measured everything, who arrived in a borrowed wagon with a bedroll and a wooden case of brass instruments and said only, "You'll come live with me now, and you'll learn to read the ground the way other folks read scripture." She did not understand, at 9, what a gift that sentence was. She would understand it fully only much later, on a hillside, with a shovel in her hands, and nowhere else in the world left to go. The wagon ride out to his claim took the better part of a day, and she remembered it in fragments the way children remember things, not as a continuous road, but as a series of still pictures, the dust rising behind the wheels like a curtain being drawn on one life. The way he did not try to fill the silence with comfort, did not tell her that everything would be all right, because he was not a man who dealt in things he could not measure. He handed her a canteen when she was thirsty, and a blanket when the wind picked up past 4 o'clock, and that was the whole of his consolation, and somehow it was enough. His place sat 2 miles outside Willow Bend, a low sod house with a plank floor he had laid himself, and a barn that leaned very slightly to the east in a way he said he had accounted for in the original grading, and would thank her not to worry about. There was a garden her grandmother had kept before she too had died, years before, of causes he never discussed, and there was a smokehouse, and there was, standing in the yard like a sentinel, a surveyor's tripod he had never bothered to bring inside, weathered silver gray, its brass fittings gone the color of an old penny. She slept that first night in a bed that was not her own, under a quilt that smelled of someone else's grandmother, and she cried without making a sound, because she had learned already, in 9 short years, that grief made adults uncomfortable, and that a quiet child was a manageable child. In the morning he was already up, standing in the yard with the tripod set and a brass compass in his palm, and when she came out onto the step in her nightdress, he did not tell her to go back inside. He said, "Come here and look through this," and she did, and the world, through the little glass, was suddenly full of numbers and degrees, and something in her, some restlessness, that had had nowhere to go since the sick room, settled, just slightly, for the first time in 6 days. He did not coddle her in the weeks that followed, and he did not ignore her either. He gave her chores size to her hands, and lessons size to her attention, and he watched her, always, with the particular patience of a man who had spent his whole working life waiting for the land to reveal what was true beneath what merely appeared. It would be some time yet before she understood that he was teaching her a language, one written in elevation and drainage and the angle of a slope, and longer still before she understood that this language would be the only inheritance that mattered, the only one no cousin's signature could ever take from her. The seasons that followed taught her more than any single lesson could have held on its own. Her grandfather began before sunrise, when the frost still silvered the fence rails, and he would crouch beside her at the edge of a field with a stick in the dirt, drawing lines that meant nothing to her at first, and everything to her later. A rise here, a hollow there, the way water would run in April, though there was no water to be seen in December. He taught her to read the land the way other children were taught their letters, patiently, without hurry, repeating the same lesson 3 mornings running, if the frost had erased his stick lines overnight. He showed her how a slope facing south drank more sun than one facing north, how a hillside with the right pitch could hold warmth the way a good coat held it, sealed in rather than let go. She did not know, kneeling beside him in 1876 with dirt under her fingernails and her breath fogging in the cold, that she was memorizing the exact geometry that would one day keep her alive. He gave her the compass to hold more and more often as the years passed, though it remained his. She understood, without being told, that some things were lent before they were given. He showed her how to sight a line true, how to correct for the hairline crack in the glass that skewed the reading half a degree if you did not know to account for it, and he made her account for it every time, until the correction became instinct rather than arithmetic. He taught her to cut sod in even bricks, grass side down, and to stack them so the walls would breathe instead of rot. And he taught her, though she would not need this particular lesson for 8 more years, how a dugout set into a hillside at the proper angle could hold a fire's warmth long after the fire itself had gone to ash, the earth itself doing the work that 4 thin walls of a proper house could never do. Between the lessons there were ordinary things, a cracked bell that called them to supper, a rooster that crowed at the wrong hour every single morning of her childhood, the smell of her grandfather's pipe tobacco clinging to his canvas coat even in July heat. There were Sundays when he read to her from a worn Bible, and Tuesdays when he did not, evenings when he spoke of her mother's laugh, and evenings when he said nothing at all and simply sat with his hand resting near hers on the porch rail, the two of them, watching the sky go the color of a bruise over the western fields. She grew from 9 to 14 in that slow accumulation of ordinary days, not yet knowing that every one of them was being banked against a winter still years off, a winter she could not yet imagine needing to survive alone. By the time she was 15, the compass had already begun its slow migration from her grandfather's coat pocket to hers, though he had not yet spoken the words that would make it hers by right. He let her carry it on their walks along the section lines, let her sight through the vein at a fence post or a distant cottonwood, correcting her stance with 2 fingers pressed lightly against her shoulder rather than any word of instruction. He believed, and told her so only once, that a body learned the land through the legs and the wrist before it ever learned it through the mind, and that a surveyor who could not feel a slope through his boots had no business trusting the numbers his instrument gave him. She learned to read the give of soil underfoot, the difference between ground that would hold a foundation and ground that would swallow one after the first hard rain. She learned to notice how a hillside facing south drank the winter sun differently than one facing north, how the frost came later, to some furrows than to others, planted not 40 feet away, how the wind found certain draws and avoided others entirely, as if by old agreement. These were not lessons written in any book he owned, though he owned several, their spines cracked from his own thumbing. They were lessons carried in his hands, in the calluses at the base of each finger, in the way he could stand at the edge of a field and tell her, without instrument or chain, within a rod of where the true line ran. It was in the autumn of her 16th year that the county came through with its own survey crew, young men in clean shirts who set their tripod on a knoll half a mile east and pronounced a boundary that did not match the one her grandfather had walked for 30 years. He said nothing to the crew. He said nothing to the neighbors who came asking. He walked home that evening, unrolled his old leather case of field notes at the kitchen table, and set her to copying his original figures into a second ledger, in her own hand, in ink that would not fade the way his was beginning to. She did not understand, then, why he watched her write with such a stillness in his face, why he checked each line against his own 3 times before nodding once and closing the book. She only understood, years later, digging into a hillside with nothing left to her name but $19 and a cracked brass compass, that he had been teaching her to keep proof of what was true long before either of them had cause to need it. The dugout, by November of 1884, had begun to feel less like a wound in the earth and more like a room a person could live inside without apology. She had packed the sod roof in 3 overlapping layers, the way he had shown her behind the barn when she was 13, laying each strip root side down so the grass would knit itself into a single skin against the rain. She had braced the entrance with cottonwood timber hauled 1.5 miles on a borrowed sledge, and she had learned, the hard way, that a door hung an inch too shallow would let the wind find every seam in a house no matter how well the walls were packed. The nights had turned cold enough by then that she measured the temperature not with any instrument, but with her own body, waking at intervals to press her palm to the earthen wall, and find it, always, warmer than the air outside, a fact she began recording in a tally book bought for a nickel in Willow Bend, not because she believed anyone would care, but because her grandfather had taught her that a thing written down was a thing that had happened, and a thing not written down could be argued away by anyone with a clean shirt and a tripod. It was while deepening the root cellar, chasing the cool, stable earth another 2 feet back into the hillside so that a winter's worth of potatoes and salted meat might keep, that her spade struck something that was not stone and was not root. She knelt in the lamplight, brushing loose dirt with fingers gone stiff from the cold, and found a course of fieldstone set too evenly to be natural, mortared with a hand she did not recognize but a patience she did. Behind it, in a niche no wider than a stovepipe, sat a bundle wrapped in oilskin gone dark and brittle at the folds, tied with a leather cord that crumbled slightly when she touched it. She did not open it that night. She set it on the shelf beside the compass and sat back on her heels, looking at the 2 objects together, the cracked glass catching the lamp at an angle, the oilskin packet still bearing, faintly, the pressure of years, and felt something she would later describe, when pressed, only as a stillness in the chest, the same stillness she remembered on her grandfather's face the evening he had watched her copy his figures into a second ledger and told her nothing of why it mattered. Outside, the wind moved over Spooner's Ridge, the way it had moved for 100 years before her, and would move for 100 after, indifferent to what she had just found buried in the wall of her own hillside. She let it sit through the night and through the morning that followed, which tells you something about the kind of patience her grandfather had put into her, because a lesser person would have torn the oilskin open by lamplight and damned the consequences to the paper inside. Instead, she fed the stove, checked the traps she had set along the draw below the ridge, and only near noon, with the door propped to let in a wedge of pale November light, did she sit at the plank table and begin working the cord loose with the flat of her knife. The leather gave in pieces. The oilskin beneath had kept its shape better than she expected, folded in thirds the way her grandfather folded every document he considered worth keeping. She had watched him do it 100 times over 100 different papers, tax receipts and survey chits, and letters from men long dead, and the fold itself was almost a signature. Inside, the paper was foxed at the edges but whole, and the ink, though browned, held its lines with a surveyor's discipline, columns of bearings and distances, a hand-drawn plat with section corners marked in a notation she recognized because he had taught her that same notation, sitting beside him on an overturned crate the summer she turned 11, his pipe smoke curling past her ear, while he corrected her figures without once raising his voice. She did not understand, not fully, not that first sitting, what she was holding. She saw dates, 1861, and a description of acreage that matched, near as she could reckon from memory, the shape of the home claim near Willow Bend, the fence lines, and the creek bend she had walked 1,000 times as a girl. She saw her grandfather's initials at the bottom of the plat, the same initials worn into the brass of the compass now sitting on the shelf above her, and she saved that thought for later, the two objects speaking to each other in a way she could not yet put into words. Beneath the field notes lay a second paper, shorter, formal in its language, bearing a notary's seal gone soft at one corner from age or damp. She read it twice before she let herself believe what it said. Then she set it down flat on the table, weighted its corners with a stone from the sill so the draft would not lift it, and sat very still, listening to the wind work at the sod above her head, the way it had worked at it every night since she'd raised the roof. Outside, 11 miles east, in an office lit by a window, a cousin kept clean out of habit rather than pride, ledgers were being closed for the evening, in ignorance of what had just surfaced from a hillside he had once called worthless. She did not sleep that night, not in the way sleep is usually understood, though she lay down at the usual hour and pulled the wool blanket to her chin and let the lamp burn low on the shelf beside the compass. She lay listening instead, the way her grandfather had taught her to listen to weather coming in off the flats, and what she heard was not wind or coyote or the settling of packed earth, but the sound of her own thinking, turning the notary's seal over and over the way a person turns a coin to see if both faces truly match. November had come in hard that year, the ground gone iron at the edges of the ridge, and she had banked the fire twice before midnight, only to find the room holding its heat, the way it always did, 60 degrees and steady, a fact she had begun recording in the tally book, not out of pride, but out of the surveyor's habit of writing down what was true, whether or not anyone asked to see it. In the morning, she read the document a third time, standing this time, coat still on, breath visible for the half-second before the dugout's warmth settled over her. The language was plain enough for a woman raised by a man who distrusted flourish in writing as much as in speech. A corrected will, dated 18 months before the will the cousin had filed, naming her sole heir to the claim, witnessed by two names she recognized from church rolls long since moved on or buried. She thought of her grandfather sitting at this same kind of table decades earlier, in some other dispute over some other line on some other man's plat, choosing to hide rather than to fight in the open, the way a careful man hides seed corn from a bad winter, rather than trust it to a barn that might burn. She did not go to Willow Bend that day, nor the next. She told herself this was patience, the same patience he had drilled into her over a compass and a chain, and there was truth in that, but there was also the plainer truth that a paper found in a root cellar meant nothing yet against a man's signature already sitting in a county ledger, filed and stamped and believed. She would need more than belief. She would need the field notes to match ground that still existed, fence lines that had not shifted, a boundary stake that had not rotted or been pulled. So she wrapped both papers back in the oilskin, tucked them behind a board she cut and fitted herself, and went out to look at her own walls with a builder's eye, thinking already of how a thing proven on paper still had to be proven again, later, out in the weather, where the land itself would have the final word. The frost had come early that year, the kind that silvers the grass before the sun is fully up and burns off by 9, and she used those quiet mornings to do what her grandfather would have called the slow work, the checking and rechecking that a man in a hurry never does, and a man who has been burned once never skips again. She walked the old boundary from memory, pacing it as he had taught her, counting her strides against the chain lengths recorded in his notes, and where his notes said, a stake should stand at 212 rods from the section corner, she found, half buried under 8 years of grass and silt, the blackened stump of a cedar post, its iron pin still true beneath the rot. She knelt there a long while, brushing the dirt away with her fingers rather than a trowel, because some things deserve to be uncovered slowly, the way a person uncovers an old letter rather than tearing it open. She did not tell the widow at first. She did not tell anyone. She carried the knowledge the way she carried the compass, close and quiet, and went back to her ordinary work, mixing tallow into her lamp oil against the coming dark, mending the harness she used for hauling sod, listening to the wind change on the ridge and knowing, from years of her grandfather's patient instruction, what kind of winter that particular wind promised. But underneath the ordinary work ran the other work, the harder work, the one she did at night by lamplight, with the oilskin papers spread flat under 2 flat stones to keep them from curling, matching creek bends to creek bends, matching the angle of an old fence line, to the angle drawn in faded ink, checking whether the land itself still agreed with what her grandfather had written 30 years before. It agreed, more often than not. That was the thing that frightened her most, in a low, steady way that never became panic, not because the papers might be wrong, but because they might be entirely right, and a claim that correct, sitting quiet and unfiled for 8 years, could not stay quiet forever. Sooner or later she would have to carry it into town, into the same office with the same ledger and the same counting drawer, and set it down in front of the same man who had once counted out $19 to her without raising his voice. She was not ready for that yet. She told herself it was the papers that were not ready, that she needed one more season of walking the line, one more comparison of stake to stump, route to record. But some nights, sitting with the lamp low and the compass beside her hand, she let herself admit that it was she herself who was not yet ready to stand across that counter again. Winter came late that year, but when it arrived with intention, and she spent the first hard freeze of 1885 not thinking of courtrooms at all, but of the flue draft in her soddy roof, which had begun to whistle in a way that told her the packed sod above it had settled unevenly through autumn. She climbed the outside grade with a spade and a bundle of fresh-cut prairie hay before the sun was fully up, working by feel more than sight, tamping and layering the way her grandfather had shown her when she was 12 years old, and thought sod cutting was a chore invented purely to make her hands ache. She remembered him saying that a roof was a promise you made to your own future comfort, and that a lazy man's roof always told on him by February. Her roof, that winter, told nothing at all. The widow from the next section line rode over in January with a thermometer borrowed from the mercantile, more out of stubborn disbelief than hospitality, and stood in the dugout's low doorway shaking snow from her shawl, muttering that she intended to prove the girl a liar about the temperature once and for all. She left 40 minutes later without the thermometer, having tucked it instead into the shelf by the stove, saying only that a body could not argue with a number, and that 61 degrees in a Nebraska January was either witchcraft or good sense, and she had never once believed in witchcraft. That visit did more for her standing on the ridge than any survey line ever could. Word passed the way it always passed in a county with more sky than people, slowly, then all at once, and by the spring thaw she had 3 separate families asking after her rates for laying out foundations, and one asking, more quietly, whether she might look over a filing at the land office that didn't seem to sit right on the plat. She said she would consider it. She did not say that she still could not walk past the land office door without feeling $19 pressed flat and counted into her palm, coin by coin, without a single word of apology attached to any of them. She took the foundation work first. It asked less of her than the filings did, required no proximity to the counting drawer, and paid in cash she could set aside toward a proper timber floor before the packet in the root cellar wall demanded, as she knew eventually it would, to be carried somewhere far less forgiving than her own quiet hillside. The foundation work took her through May and into June of 1885, and she learned quickly that laying out a family's future in string and stakes required a different patience than digging her own shelter had. A homestead's corners had to be argued gently into existence, a husband wanting the house square to the road, a wife wanting it square to the wind, and both of them watching her the way people watch a bridge they are not yet sure will hold their weight. She used her grandfather's chain for every job, though by then 2 of its links had been resoldered by a blacksmith in Willow Bend, who asked no questions and charged her 50 cents, and she carried the compass in her coat pocket even when the sun was high enough that she had no need of it, because carrying it had become less a matter of surveying and more a matter of company. She was careful, in those months, about what she let herself want. Wanting the timber floor was safe. It was a want with a dollar figure attached to it, and dollar figures she understood the way other people understood Scripture. Wanting the packet in the root cellar wall to matter to a judge someday was a different kind of want, one with no fixed sum, and she had learned early and hard what happened to a person who let an unfixed want run loose in her chest for too long. So she rationed it. She allowed herself to think of the oilskin and its contents perhaps once a week, usually on a Sunday, usually while she was doing something with her hands that required no thought at all, mending a hem, oiling the compass hinge, scraping mud from a boot heel, and then she folded the thought closed again, the way she folded the packet's oilskin wrapping, corner over corner, and set it back in its place until the next Sunday came around. The widow noticed this rationing before anyone else did, the way she noticed most things, and said nothing about it directly, only remarked one evening over coffee that a person could go broke saving up a feeling, same as saving up a coin, and that neither kind of saving did a soul much good if the roof fell in before it got spent. She said this while looking at the ceiling of the dugout, not at the young woman across from her, and then she said nothing further, and the two of them sat a while longer in a warmth that owed nothing to the stove, which had gone cold an hour before and had not yet been missed. By July, there was a second family asking about foundations, a small herd bought on credit that needed fencing surveyed before the bank would extend another season's loan, and a letter, brief, official, and addressed in a clerk's careful hand she recognized instantly, waiting for her at the land office, unopened, under her own name for the first time in 3 years. She did not open the letter at the counter. She had learned that much from the widow, who held that a person ought never let a clerk watch her face do the work a face does when it does not expect kindness, and so she folded it once, unopened, into the breast pocket of her coat, and walked the 11 miles back to the ridge with it there, pressed flat against her, like a coal carried in cupped hands, so as not to lose the heat of it before she could use it for something. She had guessed, of course, what it likely was. The cousin's hand did not change from year to year. It slanted the same careful way it had slanted on the eviction notice 7 years before, the same economy of ink, as though he begrudged the paper its use. She thought of him now less as a man and more as a season she had passed through, the way a person thinks of a hard winter once the thaw has come, not with tenderness, but without the old sharpness either, the memory worn smooth by handling. She waited until the lamp was lit and the widow had gone home across the draw before she broke the seal. Inside was not what she had feared, and not quite what she had hoped. A notice, dry and procedural, that the matter of the original homestead claim had been entered onto the territorial court's docket for the autumn session, on the strength of a petition she herself had filed 18 months before and had nearly stopped believing would ever be read. There was no apology in it, there was no acknowledgement of the years between. It was, in its way, exactly the kind of document her grandfather had spent a lifetime teaching her to respect, a thing that said only what it meant, and meant only what it said, and left the rest to be proven with chain and stake and ink already dry. She set it on the shelf beside the compass, the two objects making an odd pair, one cracked and warm with handling, the other crisp and cold with the smell of the clerk's office still on it, and she sat a long while in the dugout's steady, unbothered warmth, thinking not of the cousin, nor of the ruling to come, but of the field notes still folded in their oilskin in the tin box beneath the floorboard, waiting for their one appointed use, the way a tool waits on a nail, patient, sharpened, certain of its turn. Outside, the wind moved over the ridge the way it had moved every night for 7 years, finding no purchase in the packed sod, sliding past as if the hill were simply another stone. She banked the fire, though it hardly needed banking, and let herself, for the first time since spring, imagine the inside of the courthouse, the tall windows, the smell of varnish and dust, the sound her own voice would make in a room built to make voices small. She slept badly that night, though the dugout gave her no reason to, its air holding steady at the temperature it always held, the one the widow had once measured with a borrowed thermometer and refused to believe until she measured it twice. It was not the cold that kept her turning, it was 1885, come back to her, uninvited, the way old years do when a new paper crosses a shelf and disturbs the dust of an older one. She had gone that first winter, 5 months into the digging, to the county office on an errand that had nothing to do with claims, a dispute between two homesteaders over a fence line, the kind of small grievance that had begun, by then, to find its way to her, rather than to any surveyor, with a license and a fee. She remembered standing at the counter while the cousin totaled figures in a ledger 3 feet away, his pen moving in the same patient, unhurried strokes she recalled from the Tuesday morning he had counted out $19 onto that same counter, bill by bill, as though the exactness of the sum excused the shape of the act. He had not looked up at her that day in 1885 either. He rarely did. It was not shame, she had decided by then, or not only shame, it was a man keeping his eyes on the columns because the columns were the only part of his life that behaved as he expected them to. She had not told him, that day or any day after, what she had found sealed in the wall behind the loose stone the previous November. She had folded the oilskin back into its tin, replaced the floorboard, and gone on hauling sod and mending harness and drawing property lines for men who paid her in coin, in seed corn, in the occasional slaughtered hog dragged up the ridge on a sledge, and she had let the years accumulate around the secret, the way frost accumulates on a window, one thin layer at a time, until the whole pane was covered, and no one thought to ask what lay beneath it. Now the corrected will lay on the shelf where anyone might see it, and the waiting had a shape to it that the hiding never had. She rose before first light, lit the lamp, though the walls needed no warming, and took down the tin box from beneath the floorboard for the first time in years, without any reason but to look at the field notes again. Her grandfather's hand, small and even, the ink browned but legible, the plat lines drawn with a straight edge worn smooth from 30 years of use before it ever reached her. She traced one boundary line with her finger, the way he had taught her to trace it, west to the section corner, north along the section line, and thought, not for the first time, that a man could disappear from the earth and still leave behind a hand that moved exactly as it always had, waiting on a page for someone patient enough to follow it. The lamp threw a low gold circle over the shelf, and outside the small window the sky was doing the particular gray into blue that came before a Nebraska dawn in late autumn, a color she had learned to read the way her grandfather had read pressure in the air before a storm. She had not intended, that morning, to think of the courthouse at all. She had intended only to look at the field notes, to touch the paper the way a person touches a scar, to be sure it has healed, and not merely closed over. But the mind did not obey such small intentions, and by the time she had folded the oilskin back around the plat and set the tin box on the table, rather than returning it beneath the floor, she was already turning over, in that patient and methodical way her grandfather had trained into her hands more than her thoughts, the sequence of what would have to happen next. There was a district judge who rode circuit through 4 counties and reached Willow Bend perhaps twice a year, and there was a filing clerk beneath him who would need the documents notarized fresh, since the old notary's seal from 1861 would carry weight but not standing on its own. There was the matter of witnesses, of whom none remained living who had watched her grandfather draw those boundary lines except the land itself, and there was the cousin, who would have to be told, or who would have to learn it the way he had always learned things, through a paper set before him at his own counter, in his own hand of receiving, so that the irony of it would not need to be spoken aloud by her. She thought of him now with less heat than she once had, not because the injustice had cooled, but because 5 winters at Spooner's Ridge had taught her that heat, wasted in a fire that no one stood near to feel, only burned the wood faster. She had watched him, across those years, at a distance that was itself a kind of information, watched him grow neither richer nor freer, watched the land office narrow around him the way a coat narrows around a man who has stopped growing into it. She did not wish him ruin, she wished him accountable, which was a different and quieter appetite, one her grandfather would have recognized, since he had spent his working life making other men's boundaries honest, whether they wished it or not. She dressed for the cold, took the compass from its nail by the door, and stepped out into air that had gone sharp overnight, the grass silvered, the ridge quiet in the way it was always quiet before a decision. Somewhere down the slope her own cattle stood breathing steam into the morning. She had a letter to write to the circuit judge's clerk, and she had, for the first time since November of 1884, a reason to walk the 11 miles back toward Willow Bend, not as someone driven off, but as someone arriving. The walk to Willow Bend that morning was one she had made perhaps 200 times in 7 years, for grain and nails and news, and yet she noticed, as she came down off the ridge and struck the wagon road, that her feet fell differently than they had in any of those earlier trips, not faster, not lighter, only more evenly, the way a horse walks once it has stopped listening for the whip. The frost was already burning off the low ground by the time she passed the Hallorans' fence line, and Mrs. Halloran's daughter, out early with the milk pail, lifted a hand to her without a word, which was its own kind of greeting in that country, where words were rationed like coffee. She kept the oilskin packet inside her coat, against her ribs, where she could feel its shape through the wool with every step. The field notes, the plat, the corrected will, folded now for the 11-mile walk in a square of waxed canvas she had cut herself the night before, because paper that had survived 7 years sealed in stone deserved better than a satchel bouncing against a saddle. The compass she carried in her hand rather than her pocket, the crack in its glass catching the low sun in a thin white line each time she turned it, though she had no need of it that day. It was not for finding a boundary, it was for remembering who had first drawn one. The circuit judge's clerk kept an office 2 doors down from the land office itself, a fact she had confirmed twice before setting out, because she did not intend to walk past the window where her cousin sat without knowing exactly where she was going and why, and without him seeing that she knew it too. She had thought, more than once through that autumn, about whether to send the letter by post instead, and spare herself the 11 miles and the window, and the old ache of the doorway, where a Tuesday morning notice had once been read to her, in a voice that held no cruelty, and no comfort either. But a letter sent was a letter that could be lost, delayed, misfiled by a clerk with reasons of his own to be slow, and she had learned, digging into a hillside with her grandfather's tools, that the things worth keeping were the things you put your own hands on until they were finished. She reached the town line a little after 9, the frost gone now, the mud beginning under the wheels of a freight wagon ahead of her, and she stopped for a moment, at the crest of the last low rise, where the whole huddle of Willow Bend lay below her, the church, the mercantile, the land office with its narrow window catching the sun, and she found that she was not afraid of it, not the way she had been afraid walking away from it 7 years before with $19 and a satchel. She was only, she noted, very awake. She came down the last rise slowly, letting the freight wagon pull ahead of her into the mud, and she thought, not for the first time, that a town looked smaller each year a person stayed away from it, and larger each year a person carried it inside her without meaning to. Willow Bend had not grown much since 1884. A second mercantile had gone up and failed within 2 seasons, its board front still lettered with a name no one bothered to paint over. The church had a new bell, donated, she'd heard, by a rancher's widow who wanted her husband remembered louder than he'd lived. But the land office stood exactly as it had, narrow window and all, and she found her eyes going to it the way a tongue goes to a broken tooth, testing whether the ache was still there. It was there. It had simply changed shape. She had in her satchel, wrapped now in a second layer of oilcloth over the original oilskin, the field notes and the plat and the corrected will, and beneath them, wrapped separately so the brass would not scratch the paper, her grandfather's compass, with its hairline crack, catching whatever light came through. She had carried it 11 miles for a filing that required, strictly speaking, none of it. The territorial court's clerk had asked only for the notarized copies, which she'd had made in Lincoln the autumn before, at some expense and greater patience. But she had learned that some things were carried not because the law demanded them, but because a person needed, at the hour of reckoning, to have her own hands on the whole of the proof, not merely the copy of it. The land office door was propped open against the spring air, and she could see, before she reached it, a shape bent over the same high desk where $19 had once been counted out to her in silver and small bills. No malice in the counting. He had grayed at the temples in 7 years. He wore the same manner of collar, a little more worn at the fold. She stood a moment in the doorway, the mud drying on her boots, and she noted, the way she noted weather, or the pitch of a roof, or a fence line run 6 inches off true, that her heart was not pounding. It was only, as she had told herself at the crest of the rise, very awake. He looked up before she spoke. Whatever was in his face was not surprise, not quite, but something adjacent to it, the look of a man who has been expecting a letter, and receives instead the person who might have written it. He set down his pen with a small, deliberate care, as though the moment required it, and he said her name, not the family name only, but the whole of it, formally, the way it might appear on a filing, and waited. the way a clerk waits for a document to be laid on his desk, for whatever she had come to bring him. She did not sit, though he gestured, with the same reflexive courtesy he had shown her 7 years before, toward the chair opposite his desk. She had learned, in the years between, that a person standing holds a room differently than a person seated, and this was not a room she meant to be folded into. She set the satchel on the corner of the desk instead, and from it she drew the oilskin packet, still faintly stiff with the cold it had kept for 7 winters in the root cellar wall, and she laid it down between them with the same unhurried care he had used in setting down his pen. He did not touch it at once. His eyes went to it, then to her, then back, the way a man's eyes move over a fence line he suspects has been moved in the night. Outside, a wagon passed on the frozen street, its wheels cracking the ruts, and neither of them looked toward the window. "That's my grandfather's hand," she said, "on the plat. You'll know it. You filed enough of his surveys in your first years at this desk to know it." He did reach for it then, slowly, the way a man reaches for a thing he half hopes will turn out to be something other than what it is. He untied the cord. He unfolded the field notes first, the ink browned but legible, the columns of bearings and distances as neat as her grandfather had ever kept them, and then the plat itself, the boundary lines drawn true, and beneath it, folded smaller, the second document, the one she had read so many times in 7 years that she no longer needed to see the words to know their order. She watched his face while he read it. She had thought, walking the 11 miles into town that morning, with the packet wrapped against her chest, that she might feel something like triumph when this moment came, and she was surprised, standing in it now, at how little that was so. What she felt instead was closer to what she felt each November when she checked the root cellar's temperature against the thermometer nailed by the door, a plain, unadorned confirmation that a thing long suspected had proven, on measurement, to be exactly as suspected. He set the papers down. He did not argue their authenticity, did not reach for the excuses a lesser man might have reached for, a claim of forgery, a claim of tampering, the small cheap defenses of men caught short. He only looked at the notarized seal for a long moment, and then at her, and something crossed his face that was not quite grief, and not quite fear, but shared a border with both. "Where?" he said, and his voice had gone careful, the voice of a clerk choosing words he knows will be recorded. "Did you say you found this?" "In the wall behind the root cellar's loose stone," she said, "where a man might hide something he did not trust to a lockbox or a bank." She did not elaborate further, and she watched him understand, without her saying it plainly, that the hiding place had a history he had never been told, that his uncle had learned, once, decades before either of them were born to the trouble, that paper filed in a county office could be lost, or burned, or quietly misplaced by men with an interest in its disappearing, and had chosen instead to trust oilskin and stone and his own 2 hands. The clerk's desk he had built his whole standing on, she thought, had never taught him that lesson, because it had never needed to. His had always been the hand doing the filing, not the hand fearing what filing could do to a person. He asked, still careful, "You knew it was there all this time?" "I did not," she said. "I found it in November of '84, reinforcing a wall that was sweating damp behind the stone. I did not open it that winter. I did not open it for some while after, if you want the truth of it." This was true, though she did not tell him why, that she had sat with the packet unopened on the shelf beside the cracked compass for the better part of a season, afraid that whatever was inside would either mean nothing and confirm that her exile was simply the shape of the world, or mean everything and require of her a fight she was not certain she had the money or the years to win. She had chosen, in the end, to open it on a night in February, when the wind outside had been trying the door for 6 straight hours, and the thermometer by the cellar had read 61 degrees, steady as a held breath, and she had thought, "Whatever this says, I have already built something that holds." The recorder, a thin man with ink-stained cuffs, who had said nothing through the whole exchange, cleared his throat and asked whether she wished the boundary correction filed that same afternoon, or held for the formal hearing date already set. She said the hearing date would do. There was no urgency in her, now that the papers were seen, only the old patience, the kind her grandfather had drilled into her over a chain, and a transit on 100 quiet mornings. The patience of a woman who had learned that a boundary, once correctly measured, does not need to be defended loudly, only recorded truly. Her cousin was still looking at the seal on the corrected will, turning it slightly toward the window light, as though a different angle might change what it said. It did not. Outside, a wagon passed with a sound of harness bells, ordinary and unhurried, the way an ordinary Tuesday sounds to everyone in it, who is not, that day, having their whole understanding of a decade rearranged. He set the will down at last, carefully, the way a man sets down something that might still be hot to the touch, though he knows better. He did not argue the notarization. He did not ask when the packet had been sealed, or how long it had waited behind that stone. Perhaps he understood already, in the private arithmetic he kept behind his ledger face, that 7 years of filings and fees and Tuesday mornings had all rested on a document his uncle had quietly outlived. The recorder made a note in his own hand, unhurried, the pen scratching in the kind of silence that fills a room after a decision has already been made, and only the paperwork remains to catch up to it. She thought, watching him, of the winter her grandfather had shown her, how a chain could lie flat across broken ground and still tell the truth if a person read it right, how the earth might rise and fall, but the measurement did not lie about where one man's claim ended and another's began. She had carried that lesson 11 miles west with $19 and a cracked compass, and she had carried it every year since, through sod walls and root cellars, and the slow accumulation of other people's trust in her level and her word. It had never once occurred to her, in all that carrying, that the lesson would return to her exactly this way, not as a tool she used on someone else's land, but as the very proof that unearthed her own. Her cousin gathered his hat from the chair beside him, turning it once in his hands before he spoke, and what he said was not an apology, because he was not, by nature or training, a man who apologized. He asked, instead, in the flat clerking voice he had used on a Tuesday morning 7 years before, whether the hearing would require him to appear, or whether the correction could proceed on the strength of the documents alone. She told him he would be expected, the same as anyone with a claim to answer for. He nodded at that, as a man nods at a filing fee he has always known he would eventually owe. Outside, the wagon bells faded down the street, and the light through the window had shifted enough that the dust on the counter showed gold instead of gray. She folded the oilskin back over the corrected will with the same care she had used unwrapping it, and the recorder asked her, almost gently, where she meant to be staying until the hearing date came round, as though the answer might matter to him, or as though he already guessed that a woman who had built a house that never dropped below 60 degrees would not be difficult to find. She told him Spooner's Ridge, the same as always, and watched something pass over his face that was not quite surprise, more the recognition a man has when a sum he has been avoiding finally comes due in full. He wrote it down anyway, in the same square clerking hand he used for every other entry, as if her address were no different from a filing on grain storage or a lien on a plow horse. She supposed, in his ledger, it wasn't. Outside, the street had gone quiet, in the way county towns go quiet in late afternoon. The freight wagons unloaded, the mercantile's awning throwing a long blue shadow across the boardwalk. She walked to where her horse stood tied at the rail, and did not mount right away. She stood with one hand on the pommel, and looked back at the land office window, at the shape of him still bent over the counter, and found that she felt none of what she had expected to feel. Not triumph, not even the particular satisfaction of a debt finally acknowledged, only a kind of tiredness that sat in her shoulders, like sod stacked too high on a green roof, waiting to settle. She rode north out of town, with the packet wrapped again in oilskin, and pressed flat against her ribs beneath her coat, and she thought, as she often did on that road, of the year she had first ridden it the other direction, $19 folded into a handkerchief, the compass in her satchel, the wind coming down off the bluffs with nothing to stop it. 11 miles had seemed farther then. It seemed shorter now, though the road had not changed, only she had, and the horse under her was better fed than the one she'd walked beside back then, because back then she'd had no horse at all. By the time the ridge came into view, The sun was low enough to catch the soddy's south wall and turn the packed earth the color of a harvest wheat field, and smoke was rising thin and straight from the chimney pipe her neighbor kept lit against the evening chill. She had told no one the hearing date yet. She meant to, that night, over the kind of supper that did not require conversation to be good company, bread and butter, and the silence of two women who had earned the right to sit without filling every minute with talk. But first she meant to stop at the root cellar door, as she always did coming home, and press her palm flat against the cool earth wall just inside it, the way she had the November she'd found the packet behind the loose stone, before any of this had a date attached to it at all. The wall was cooler than the evening air outside, as it always was, a fact she had recorded in her tally book so many winters ago, that the ink had gone the color of weak tea, and she stood there now with her hand flat against it, the way a person might rest a hand against the flank of an animal that had carried them faithfully and asked nothing back. 60 degrees, the book said, and 60 degrees it had stayed, through the winter of '86 when the wind took the roof off a barn in Willow Bend, through the winter of '89 when 3 horses froze standing in a neighbor's corral not 4 miles distant. The earth did not care what year the calendar claimed. It only did what it had been built to do, which was hold warmth, the way a promise holds shape long after the person who made it has forgotten the words. Her neighbor came to the door with a lamp already lit, though the light outside had not yet failed, and looked at her the way she had learned to be looked at over these 7 years, not with suspicion, not any longer, but with the plain attention of someone counting a friend's steps up a path to make sure they landed sound. "Supper is near," the widow said, and nothing else, because nothing else needed saying, and they ate at the plank table with the window open to the last of the light, and the bread was good, and the butter had come from a churn the widow had once called foolishness, and now defended to anyone who questioned it. It was only after the plates were cleared that she said it, the hearing, the date, the courthouse in Willow Bend where a man in a county office would finally have to answer for a will improperly witnessed 7 years gone. The widow set down the cup she was holding very slowly, the way a person sets down something they are afraid of dropping, and asked only one question, quiet as the lamp flame. "Are you certain the papers will hold up before a judge who never laid eyes on your grandfather?" She said she was as certain as ink and a notary's seal could make a person. She did not say what she was thinking beneath that, which was that certainty had never once kept the cousin from finding new grounds to delay, new fees to cite, new Tuesdays to schedule, and then quietly move. The widow studied her across the table a long moment, then nodded once, the way she nodded at weather she trusted, and machinery she'd tested herself, and reached for the coffee pot still warm on the stove, because there was, after all, one more cup left in it, and the night, they both understood without saying so, would be a long one before the road to Willow Bend. They drank that last cup slowly, the way people drink coffee when they are trying to hold a night together a little longer before it turns into a morning that asks something of them. Outside the window the dark had thickened into the particular blackness of a Nebraska January, no moon to speak of, the wind moving low across the ridge with a sound like something dragging its coat across dry grass. And she found herself thinking, not for the first time, of another winter kitchen, another lamp, and a man teaching a 9-year-old girl to hold a compass steady against a table edge so the needle would settle true. She thought of him now the way she always did before anything that mattered, not as a comfort exactly, but as a standard, a level line she measured herself against. She went over the packet again before sleep, though she had gone over it so many times the oilskin had softened at the fold, like a page worn thin from reading. The field notes in his hand, cramped and exact, the plat drawn with a straight edge he had made himself from ashwood, the corrected will with its notary's seal, pressed so hard into the paper it had nearly torn through. She had learned, these 7 years, to read documents the way he had taught her to read land, for what was true, beneath what was merely visible, for the boundary marker moved 11 feet by a man in a hurry, for the fence line that did not match the deed. The cousin's error, when she finally understood it whole, was not malice, it was haste, and a filing fee he had not wanted to pay twice, and a nephew's plain conviction that no one left living would ever think to check. She slept little. Toward dawn she rose and fed the stove, and stood a moment in the dugout's steady warmth, 60 degrees, and holding as it always held, no matter what the thermometer nailed to the post outside, insisted the world beyond the door was doing to a person. She thought that if her grandfather had built anything at all in his life, he had built the understanding that a structure's worth was not in how it looked from the road, but in what it kept steady when everything above it turned hard. She dressed. She wrapped the oilskin packet in a second cloth against the damp of travel and set it into the satchel beside the cracked brass compass, the two objects riding together as they had not, in truth, ridden together since the hillside gave them both back to her. The widow was already at the door with the wagon hitched by the time she stepped out into the cold, breath showing pale in the lantern light, the road to Willow Bend waiting long and dark and, at last, walkable to its end. The road to Willow Bend in November of 1891 was not the road she remembered from the spring of 1884, though it followed the same ruts and crossed the same dry creek bed where she had once stopped to rest her satchel against a fence post and count $19 for the third time, as if a fourth count might change the sum. The wagon moved slow behind a mule that had seen better decades, and the widow drove without speaking much, which was its own kind of company after 7 years of knowing when words were needed and when they were only weight. The sky held that particular gray of early winter on the plains, not yet snowing but promising it, the kind of sky her grandfather used to read by the color at its edges and call within a day, sometimes within an hour, and he was rarely wrong. She watched that sky now the way she had watched it as a girl of 10 standing beside him on the section line, and she found she was doing the arithmetic he had taught her without meaning to. Wind from the northwest, pressure dropping, a good 3 days before the roads turned to nothing a wagon could manage. Enough time, it would have to be enough time. She kept one hand near the satchel the whole ride, not gripping it, only resting there the way a person rests a hand on a door frame, to know the house is still standing. Inside, the field notes lay exactly as they had lain for 30 years in that stone niche, ink faded but legible, the plat lines drawn in her grandfather's careful surveyor's hand with the bearings noted to the minute, and beside them the corrected will with its notary seal still sharp enough to read by lamplight. She had read both documents perhaps 40 times since November, not because she doubted what they said, but because she still could not entirely believe a man dead 8 years had reached forward through the ground itself to hand her back what had been taken in a Tuesday morning transaction lasting perhaps 4 minutes. The widow finally spoke as the first low roofs of Willow Bend came into view through the gray. She said only that the county recorder opened his office at 8, and that a man who had spent his whole working life behind a filing desk would not be late to it even on a morning like this, even for this. She said it without malice, the way she said most things, and the young woman nodded and did not answer, because there was nothing left to say that the papers in the satchel would not say better, and because some part of her was already standing in that office before the wagon had covered another half-mile of frozen road. The recorder's office sat at the corner where the feed store used to be before the fire of '86, a low brick building with a stovepipe leaning slightly east from 30 winters of wind, and the wagon drew up in front of it at 7 minutes past 8 by the courthouse clock, which the widow noted aloud, not unkindly, as proof of her own prediction about men behind filing desks. The young woman climbed down stiff-legged from the seat, the satchel held against her chest, now rather than slung at her hip, as though the papers inside had grown heavier with the last mile, and she stood for a moment on the frozen boardwalk, gathering the kind of breath a person takes before stepping into water of uncertain depth. Inside, the stove was already going, and the recorder, a narrow, spectacled man named for the county, rather than for himself in most people's memory, since no one called him anything but the recorder, looked up from a ledger with the mild irritation of a man interrupted before his coffee had cooled enough to drink. He did not know her by sight. He knew her by the name on the claim book, which he had entered himself 7 years before, in a clerk's careful hand, transferring 160 acres from a dead man to a living nephew on the strength of a single witness signature. She did not announce herself as a wronged party. She set the oilskin packet on the counter, unwrapped it with fingers that had gone numb from the cold and did not shake for any other reason, and laid the field notes flat first, the bearings facing him, then the corrected will beside it, with the notary seal turned up toward the lamp he kept burning even in daylight, for exactly this kind of reading. She said only that these had been found in November of '84 in the wall of a root cellar on Spooner's Ridge, and that she believed the county would want to compare the boundary lines here against the ones currently on file for the parcel north of Willow Bend Creek. The recorder did not reach for the papers right away. He looked at them the way a man looks at a debt he has long suspected would someday come due, and then he looked past her, out the window, toward the road that led east to the land office, where a cousin of hers had likely already lit his own stove and settled into his own mourning, unaware that 8 years of quiet, unremarked labor were about to arrive at his door, wrapped in oilskin and carried by a woman he had once counted $19 into. The ruling came in April of 1891, written in the flat, unhurried language of the territorial court, which does not know how to celebrate anything and did not attempt to start now. The judge read the field notes into the record, compared them against the plat filed in 1884, and found the discrepancy exactly where she had known it would be found, 11½ degrees off true, a clerical drift that had cost her nothing until it had cost her everything. He set aside the old filing. He restored the boundary lines her grandfather had walked with a 66-foot chain in 1861. He named her, in the dry phrasing of the law, sole and rightful heir. Her cousin stood through the reading with his hat in both hands, and when it was finished, he did not argue, because there was nothing in the oilskin packet a company man of ledgers could dispute. He signed where the recorder showed him to sign. His handwriting, she noticed, had not changed at all in 7 years, still small, still careful, still the hand of a man who believed a properly filed paper was the same thing as a properly lived life. The widow neighbor was there in the gallery, arms crossed, saying nothing, though she had once called the dugout a hole for a fool, and now called it, to anyone in Willow Bend who would listen, the soundest piece of building in the county. That autumn she brought in the wheat on the reclaimed acreage and the barley at Spooner's Ridge both, and when the harvest crew assembled, she did not turn her cousin away from the wagon. She handed him a rake and pointed him toward the west field the same as any other man hired for the season, and he took the rake and worked and said very little, and that was the whole of it. No speech, no reckoning spoken aloud, just two people working a field that the law had finally agreed belonged to one of them. The county surveyor came through that November to update the plat map, and when he asked what she wanted written beside the dugout's mark, long since packed thicker with sod, timbered at the door, warm as it had always been, 60 degrees on the coldest night anyone could remember, she took the pencil from him and wrote it herself, in the same square, unhurried hand her grandfather had used on field notes 30 years buried in a wall. Built to last, not to impress. The surveyor did not ask her to explain it, and she did not offer to. Some structures speak for themselves once you have lived inside them long enough, through failing seasons, honest winters, and one very old grievance finally, quietly, corrected.